Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. You know, when I first saw the conference program, I was struggling with a very important question. Is it better to speak before or after the circus? And I think I've decided that it doesn't matter. It's just tough to be here anyway. What I'd like to talk about is the importance of private capital in the recent resurgence of economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa, and the critical role it can and needs to play if that performance is to continue. And I'd like to do that by making a few points. First, a major reason for the poor performance we've seen is the fact that we have not had real private capital, true risk capital. And by that I mean capital that demands an appropriate return on its investment. Second, we've had abysmal political leadership. And to me, what that means is the private sector needs to play an increasingly important role. Third, the recent performance of private capital investment provides concrete proof of its potential and really points the way forward. And finally, we often talk about reducing poverty in Africa. And to me, that's a big part of the problem, the language that we use. I feel like we sell Africa really short. What we should be talking about is wealth creation. I want to make Africans rich. If you make Africans rich, then they'll be less poor. That's my poverty reduction strategy. And that'll probably sound a little familiar to some of you from yesterday. So let me get started. I'd like to make my first point by reviewing a little of the performance. Sub-Saharan Africa is at the bottom of a ranking of the world's regions by GDP. That's true on an aggregate as well as a per capita basis. Now, as we heard yesterday, Sub-Saharan Africa is a big place. We have 48 countries, all with their own story. We have coastal countries, landlocked countries, resource-rich, resource-poor, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, and every other kind of phone that you can think of. One of those stories is that of South Africa, which is really a developed country hiding out in Sub-Saharan Africa. And on its own, it makes up a little over a third of Sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. And it distorts any analysis of the region. So what I've done is kind of excluded it. And no offense to the South Africans out there. And if we look at Sub-Saharan Africa without Africa, the numbers look even bleaker. GDP per capita of about $637. When I talk about Africa going forward, I'm really referring to Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. Numbers look better on a purchasing power parity basis, which takes into consideration the fact that prices are generally cheaper in poorer countries. Now, why is this the case? Well, if we look at the makeup of GDP, we see that of all the regions, Africa has the highest sectoral contribution from agriculture. The fact is, and you heard some of this from the previous speaker, that to a large extent, most of the economies in Africa are largely agrarian. And the roughly 40% contribution from industry is actually misleading. Most of that is natural resource extraction. So really what you have are economies that are essentially pre-industrial. So how did we get here? After all, if we go back to 1980, which is not that long ago, things didn't look that bad for Africa. Asia was about roughly $1,900 in GDP per capita. Central and Eastern Europe was at roughly $1,500. So they were within striking distance. Fast forward 20 years later, and GDP per capita, and this is in constant $2,000, GDP per capita in Africa is at, wait for it, roughly $1,000. Asia is at $4,000, and Central and Eastern Europe is at roughly $6,700. I know the Africa story pretty well, but I have to admit this was actually a surprising result for me. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry when I saw it. If you have a macabre sense of humor, it's actually kind of funny. And I actually did laugh for about a minute when I saw it. And it's partially explained by the growth story. If we compare Asia to Africa, we see that Asia has outperformed Africa in each of the last 4 decades. It's not until this decade that we start to see Africa outperforming Asia with growth rates in excess of 5%. If we compare two countries that are actually kind of similar, Nigeria and Indonesia, both oil exporting population giants, you see the same growth story being played out, resulting in pronounced divergence in GDP per capita. Now, the interesting thing about this story is the fact that it has occurred in the context of significant aid contributions to Africa. Over $400 billion from the 60s through 2005. On top of that, there's been $200 billion in official debt lending to African countries. And this is not counting the large amount of, I don't know how much it is, of private aid that goes into Africa. On the flip side, we've seen very low investment levels, private investment levels, less than half that of other developing regions. And so the picture that we have in Africa is one in which you have very low private capital investment because you have low foreign direct investment, and much of that is going into national resource extraction, basically taking oil and mineral resources out of these countries, and very low domestic private investment because of private wealth and capital flight. And I think one of the other speakers is going to talk about this. What investment you do have is public sector investment that's financed by debt, aid, and revenues from resource extraction. That's what I call easy money. And easy money has a very low required return on investment. And what you get when you have capital with a low required return on investment, well, you get low returns. And there have been studies that show that return on investment in Africa is actually lower than in any other region in the country, in the world. The takeaway from me here is that we need a lot more private capital in Africa, much more. And this should be capital that demands a high return on its investment. The public sector investment stories leads me to my next point. And I'd like to make this by taking a look at a map of the world, political map of the world, going back to 1977. Don't have a laser pointer here, but if we look at a map of the world, and I'm going to compare Asia and Africa here, we'll see that. Oh, okay, great. Anyway, Africa is. Here we go. Thank you. Well, okay, in the map, blue is democracy, red is communism, and yellow and white, all those colors in between, is basically everything short of full democracy. And if we compare, for example, the so-called Asian tigers, South Korea down here, you have Taiwan over here, I think Singapore, and sorry, that's Hong Kong over there, and Singapore over there. We see that they're all basically non-democratic. Africa is awash in yellow. By the way, some of you may recognize this name. We just can't seem to get rid of some of these guys. And to me, this is interesting because as we move forward through time, we see the same thing being played out. Mostly non-democratic regimes. It's getting bluer, but most of the countries are basically non-democratic. 1997, most of the world is now in democracy, and the Asian tigers have all moved that way, and Africa is also looking a lot more blue. But the point here is that political development in Asia and Africa has basically been the same. So, and if you buy the fact that the state plays a crucial role in determining the direction and performance of an economy, then you have to come to the conclusion that the only difference, the difference in performance, is due to differences in quality of the leadership. And to me, that's a big part of the problem. Basically, what we've had in Africa is two kinds of leaders. Morally bankrupt, that's the kind who are intent on lining their own pockets, and ideologically bankrupt. That's the kind who are well-intentioned but ultimately misguided. And so what's the solution? Well, I say if the politicos can't get it right, then they need to get out of the way and let private capital get it done. If Africa is to move forward, the private sector has to take an play an increasingly assertive role. Increasing private capital investment will create a constituency that has an economic stake in the economic outcomes. And that's the only way that we can get our political leaders to listen to us. I want to talk now about the recent performance of private capital. As you saw in one of the previous charts, we've started to see increasing economic growth in Africa. And that has resulted in gains in GDP per capita. I think that's directly related to the fact that, to the rise in use of mobile phones. As you can see, fixed line subscribers per 1,000 people in Africa has been fairly steady over the past 10 years. But we've seen a dramatic rise in mobile subscribers in Africa. And I think that coincides almost exactly with the increase in GDP per capita that we're seeing. This actually, you could give an entire presentation on just on this topic, but I don't have the time to do that. What I do want to talk about is how that happened. This chart shows you the private investment in telecoms over the past 10 years. Beginning in 2000, we started to see dramatic investments in private investment in telecom, over $2 billion most years since 2000. Most of that was financed by corporates, but private institutional capital played a key role. And let me give you an example. In 2001, when MTN, the South African telecoms company, came to Nigeria, they were looking for local partners. And one of the partners that they found was a local private equity fund called Capital Alliance. Capital Alliance put together a group of local investors, and they acquired a 25% stake in MTN Nigeria. Last year, a 7% stake was sold back to MTN for $350 million, valuing MTN Nigeria at $5 billion. So basically, we went from $200 million in market capitalization to $5 billion. That's a 90% return. It's not bad in any language. You've seen this chart before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's probably the third time you've seen it. But it highlights for me what the next big opportunity in Africa is. Power. It's a dark continent. Let's look at the numbers behind that map. And one of the things that we see on this map is what I call more of the Africa shuffle. That's the tendency in charts for Africa to sort of move sideways rather than up. This is electricity consumption by region, comparing Asia to Africa. Africa has been at roughly 150 kilowatt hours per person for the past 10 years. Not much change. To put that in context, I looked at my electricity bill before I left the US, and last month, my three-person household, we used about 650 kilowatt hours. Another way to look at this is, in North America, this number is actually 14,000. If I had put that on the chart, you wouldn't even see the sub-Saharan Africa line. So, what needs to be done? Well, as we can see, going back to our sectoral investment chart, investment in power has not tracked the investment in telecoms. So we need substantial investment in power to effectively do what was done in telecoms, to increase the amount of power that's being generated. And why is that important? Industrialization, which is what Africa needs now, is a hugely energy-intensive process. And without reliable supplies of electricity, it's not going to happen in Africa. And that's why this is absolutely necessary. How much investment is needed? Well, to get to 1,000 kilowatt hours, which is somewhere south of where Asia is right now, I did a rough calculation, and you need about 600 million megawatt hours of additional generation, which is about 70,000 megawatts of additional generation capacity. Before I moved into private equity, I was investing in energy in the US. And a rough number we used to use was $1 million per megawatt. So to finance the investment that's required, we would need $70 billion in additional investment. A huge number, but not inconceivable in the context of what's been invested in telecoms. And the potential returns are the same because of the amount of private generation that's currently occurring in Africa and the substantial economies of scale. Now let me talk about sort of my business, what we're trying to do. I'm trying to raise money to make some of these investments. Private equity fundraising in Africa has started to increase substantially, $2 billion last year. And a lot of this is driven by the fact that the telecom sector has been so successful. But we need much more money. And one of the things that really gets me is the fact that it's so difficult to raise private capital for Africa, and yet we have $30 to $35 billion in aid going to Africa. Now, I don't have anything against aid, but I think the proportions are a little whacked out. I mean, if there's $30 to $35 billion in aid going to Africa, then we should be able to get at least $5 to $10 billion in private capital. What I think Bono should be doing is telling the G8 to set up a fund of funds and give that money to Africans, and if they don't trust Africans, give it to Europeans or whoever to go invest in businesses in Africa. Let's create jobs. We can do that on top of aid. The other thing that is interesting about this is, again, this is talking about private equity, is the fact that a lot of the money is going into mature companies, growth and expansion and buyouts. And this is another example of Africa sort of skipping a phase. I don't think it's right here. I think the potential for venture capital is actually huge in Africa. And there are millions of entrepreneurs in Africa. Most of them will remain small. But a select few have the potential, and actually a few of them are here. I'm looking to meet some of them. But a select few have the potential to become major companies. And I'll give you a perfect example. Celtel. Some of you have their SIM cards. In 2001, that was essentially a startup. It had substantial backing from private equity. And it was sold in 2005 for $3.4 billion. And a lot of private equity firms made a lot of money. EMP's Africa Infrastructure Fund, for example, invested $50 million and made $215 million. That's the potential for investing in entrepreneurs at the early stage in Africa. And this is what I think we should be seeing a lot more of that. I'd like to finish off with the opportunity for wealth creation. Stock market capitalization right now in Africa, at the end of 2005, was $39 billion. That was about 10% of GDP. Interestingly enough, South Africa was about $565 billion, 90% of the sub-Saharan African total. And yet it only makes up a third of GDP. Doesn't make sense. So here's what I think is going to happen, and what needs to happen. If Africa just grows at 5% and we maintain the same market capitalization to GDP ratio, we'll have a market capitalization in 2010 of $50 billion. But if we increase the market capitalization ratio to 50%, we'll have a market capitalization of $240 billion, creating additional wealth of $200 billion. Now that's what I'm talking about. And some of this is actually starting to happen. If we look at the Nigerian stock market, at the end of 2005, it had a market capitalization of about $20 billion. Today, it's over $50 billion. And I'll give you an example why. There was a company in Nigeria, that was listed on the stock market called Dangote Sugar. This was a company founded in 1978 by the Nigerian entrepreneur who basically was importing processed sugar into Nigeria. In 2000, he decided to move up the value chain. And that's what we need to do in Africa. He decided to move up the value chain and started importing raw sugar and refining it in Nigeria. Today, the company is the largest sugar refiner in the country and one of the largest in the world. 30% of the company was listed on the Nigerian stock market at $415 million. Over 110,000 Nigerian shareholders, was 40% oversubscribed. Today, that initial $415 million is worth $1.6 billion. Mr. Dangote is, I have just one more thing to say. I realize I've run out of my time here. I think this wealth creation opportunity, as I said at the outset, is really what I want to talk about. But it's not about creating wealth for a few people, it's about creating wealth for everyone. And this is a wealth creation party that everyone is invited to. And if you haven't yet received an invitation, I'm issuing one to you now. Thank you. Let's go out and make some money.
Thank you.